Across the world today, there is buzz over the future of Tibetan leadership. His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, has confirmed that the institution of the Dalai Lama will continue and that only the Gaden Phodrang Trust has the authority to recognize his successor. China, however, insists that it will decide who the next Dalai Lama will be. So today at Chakra News, we speak to Tenzin Lekshay, spokesperson for the Central Tibetan Administration, to understand what this means for Tibetans, how the exiled leadership plans to counter Beijing's claims, and what comes next in the decades-long struggle for Tibet's cultural and spiritual future.
Thank you.
The Dalai Lama's statement that came out earlier today, what does this mean for Tibetans globally, but most importantly for the Tibetans who are still living in Tibet?
This statement by His Holiness today has been very significant, right? It's very important for the Tibetans, not just for the Tibetans, but for all the followers around the world who has repeatedly requested His Holiness over years that His Holiness the Dalai Lama's institution should remain, right? And today His Holiness affirms that because of all the requests coming throughout the world, right, including Tibetans from inside Tibet, including Chinese people from China, and the Himalayan people from the Himalayan country, right, Himalayan regions, and then from Mongolia, Russian federations, all of the places. But now His Holiness has decided that the institution will remain and continue. What more we need right now? Now, this present Dalai Lama, the 14, the great 14, right? He is not just the Dalai Lama of Tibet right now. He is the Dalai Lama of the world. His radiance, right, went far across the world with his love and compassion and wisdom, right? So therefore, we live in a joyous moment, not just to celebrate His Holiness' 90th birthday, but also with the statement, right, which comes today, that the institution will continue, right? So therefore, it is very important for us today.
So China's been pretty quick to come out with a counter statement. They insist that they will choose who the Dalai Lama will be. How does the CTA plan to counter Beijing's efforts and claims?
Beijing, now what does Beijing symbolize? Even though they call themselves as the representative of the people, Chinese people, the country called People's Republic of China. Does the People's Republic of China does the communist regime represents the people of China, right? So one thing it is very important for us to know is that the regime is not the defender of the faith. Over the last 7 decades of the occupation of Tibet, more than 6,000 monasteries, Tibetan monasteries, were being destroyed. Right? Tibetan lamas and monks and nuns were all been incarcerated, tortured, killed throughout. Even now, the monasteries and temples were being destroyed. Right? The monastic schools are being shut down. Even now, it's happening. So once if they, being the oppressor of the faith, how can they be the defender of the faith? How can they have the legitimacy to authorize or recognize the His Holiness? Nowhere through the history of the Tibetan Buddhist traditions that they have the authority. Is the Buddhist faith, is the Buddhist traditions, and the interference of the Chinese regime is not in consult to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Rather, they are thinking about their political interests, for the need of their political interests, that their interference is necessary for them. But somehow, when you look at His Holiness' Reincarnation, right, this is not the first Dalai Lama. We are not talking about the first Dalai Lama. We are talking about 14th Dalai Lama. Throughout the 14, right, we did it through the Tibetan Buddhist traditions without any interference from the Chinese regime or Chinese government. So therefore, China do not have any legitimate right and claim over the recognition of the reincarnation of His Holiness Dalai Lama.
As an extension to the question that I just asked you, uh, surely when China comes out with their own pretender, another claimant who has a stamp of the CCP on his side, would it be a problem for the CTA to counter such a claim?
See, our own existence is on the basis of truth and non-violence. Right? Whatever China claims all throughout their occupation of Tibet for the last 7 decades, right? Their narrative being a false narrative, right? They didn't have any authority, not just on the political issues, but also on the Tibetan religious traditions. Right. So therefore, it will not be any difficult for us to counter the Chinese narrative. Right. What China has been doing over the years is a false narrative. But they are writing and rewriting and manipulating everything for the sake of the present political convenience, which is not right. Right. So everything has to be based on truth. Right. And for the last so many years, right, our tradition, right, when you look at our tradition, this will speak volumes about who had the authority. And especially with the reincarnation of His Holiness, let me remind you, and also to the Chinese leaders, that His Holiness is the sole authority for the recognition and the reincarnation of the 15th one. Right. And today in His Holiness statement, His Holiness has emphasized the same by saying that since this is His own reincarnation, nobody except His Holiness has the authority.
Now, as I understand, the search for the 15th Dalai Lama will be, via rituals and a process which is centuries old, if not thousands of years. However, will the CTA, the Central Tibetan Administration, involve other Buddhist leaders and maybe even international authorities? How do you plan to work with international authorities and governments so that the authentic reincarnation, His authority, is uncontested?
Over the years, or even today, His Holiness said that, His Holiness expressed that the sole authority lies on Him, and He will rest upon the authority to His Gaden Phodrang Trust, the office of His Holiness Dalai Lama. Right? And in the due process, they will consult the High Lamas, right, and the oath-bound protectors, right, of Tibetan Buddhism. Right? So there are procedures, the traditions, which we have to follow. Right? This is one thing. Second thing, yes, we do need international support, right, to stand for our cause, for the movement, for the values that we cherish, right? And for that, see, China, whatever they've been doing so far, right, is not benign. Right? They are belligerent, right? So the people of the world, right, the free world, right, should let China know that the truth is truth. You cannot change lies into truth, right? Throughout the times, China has been talking about lies, pretending that they are truth, which is not truth. So therefore, I think the moment will come that the world will rise and stand along with the truth to challenge the Chinese narratives, right? And the moment has come for the world to challenge China's false narrative and counter the Chinese disinformation and misinformation.
Coming to the process that is bound to happen sooner rather than later, the Gaden Phodrang Trust will be in charge of the whole process for recognizing the 15th Dalai Lama. What role will the Tibetan people and the religious heads play in this process?
See, especially the head of the religious traditions, right? Because as His Holiness has mentioned in his statement, that there will be a consultations of the head of the Buddhist schools, right? So it'll be very important because we are not talking about anything else but of our religious traditions. When it comes to religious traditions, the consultation of the religious head is very important. And throughout, when you look back to the His Holiness incarnations for the criticism, right, there were many consultations among the religious heads and also the oath-bound protectors. So they are the unique traditions which we had. And therefore, I think that China's emphasis is all about usage of the golden urn. They want the Dalai Lama to be born in Tibet, but they want the Dalai Lama to be recognized by and chosen by the Chinese regime. But this can never happen. But with the condition that His Holiness has raised, that if the situation of Tibet remains unchanged, he'll be born in free world. His Holiness said many times, right now at this present juncture, Tibet's condition is more than ever critical. Right, more than ever critical. So now China has to work to fulfill the aspirations of Tibetan people. They cannot just do what they think is right. Right. They should look into the aspirations of Tibetan people and resolve the Sino-Tibetan conflict. This is one thing. And His Holiness also has said many times that if the Tibetan people wishes the institutions to come, now, today, His Holiness has affirmed that the institution of the Dalai Lama will come. And that too, if the situation inside Tibet remains unchanged, obviously, His Holiness will come in the free world, not in China.
When I look at the past 7 decades, the central figure in this story is His Holiness. For 7 decades, he's carried on, along with the Tibetan people, the burden of struggle for Tibetan autonomy, if not independence, right? Do you think his message earlier today is also a message to Beijing that the struggle for Tibetans will not die with him?
Of course. Right. The Tibetan civilization is not new. Right. For millennia, the Tibetan civilization has established. Right. So even now, right, because see, with the absence of His Holiness, yes, they may be shaking, there may be some kind of transitory movements, but there may be a storm also, right, coming from China or maybe. But we've been resilient throughout the time in the essence of the Dalai Lama. But that's what when I told you before that this is the 14th one, right? And we have seen 13 before, right? So therefore, we have witnessed the history, right, of not having His Holiness, the transitory times, right? Right. So at this moment also, we are preparing ourselves. We've been resilient. And His Holiness has made sure that the Tibetan people, Tibetan identity, Tibetan culture, Buddhism will remain even without His Holiness. But that moment will be a transitory moment, right? Because the next Dalai Lama will come. Right. So therefore, I think we are more than ever vigilant. We are more than ever, right, resilient, right, because of His Holiness' blessing and His guidance and His leadership throughout the passage of time, right. So we are not in worry, right, whether we are committed for the cause, not just for the sake of the Tibetan people, but for, as His Holiness envisaged, right, for the well-being of everybody. Right. So we are it will not die down, right? China thought that, okay, with the actions of His Holiness, Tibetan will die off. Nowhere. We have 6 to 7 million Tibetans, right, right, to take charge, to move forward, not just for the sake of the Tibetan people, but for the larger humanity. Right? So we will not stop by China. We cannot be stopped by China. But we will ever be more vigilant and resilient and determined.
Inspiring words, Tenzin Lekshay. Thank you so much for giving us your time. And I hope to speak to you again in the future as well. In the meantime,